Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We are in week 62 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has also been 2 weeks since the CDC relaxed the mask mandate for vaccinated Americans. In the news today, Kristen Clark has been confirmed as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, and half of the U.S. adult population is fully vaccinated according to the CDC. Today's topic is reforming law enforcement in America, and we're joined by Charles Ramsey, the former D.C. Chief of Police and Police Commissioner of Philadelphia. Chief, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, look, every once in a while, we, folks think we're smarter than we are here at Coffee with Ken, but we're fortunate enough to have you with us today on the day after the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement. A year after that tragic event, how do you feel? Have we made progress? Are we on the right track? Where are we a year after that?
Well, I mean, we've made some progress, but obviously we have a long way to go. I mean, last May 25th, the murder of George Floyd was a defining moment for policing. No question about it. But it actually started before that with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And, that was, to me, the case that really prompted real change to start taking place in policing. Soon after Michael Brown, you had Eric Gardner in New York. And right after that, I remember getting a call from the White House, President Obama, actually. He wanted me to co-chair a task force on 21st century policing, looking at issues, coming up with solutions, concrete recommendations, not just a lot of pie in the sky stuff. And so Lori Robinson, professor at George Mason and former number 3 in DOJ, and I were the 2 co-chairs, and we actually submitted a report to him in May of 2015. And it really took off. I mean, there were a lot of departments that were interested in the recommendations. There were like 59 recommendations, 92 action steps. And it began, to really kind of shift things. The past administration didn't put policing as a top priority, police reform. So things kind of slipped. And there were some departments that continued to move forward. There were others that didn't. The Justice Department was not as involved. And now you got George Floyd. And I think with George Floyd, the graphic nature of the video, that once again captured people's attention, and the focus again is on policing, and rightfully so. So there's been some progress, but not nearly enough.
So you mentioned DOJ. The federal government has a little bit of a role here, right? So talk a little bit about that, right? The House has passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. The Senate has not addressed it. What can the federal government do as it relates to police reform at a federal level? And then let's kind of talk about really where the kind of action needs to happen is probably locally.
Well, a lot of people don't realize, but there are close to 18,000 police departments in the United States. That's at the state and local level. And I guess that number includes the federal agencies too. But they're under local control or state control. And so there's no direct control from the federal government, but that doesn't mean the feds can't do things. And certainly setting some standards, for an example, creating that national database for officers that are fired for acts of misconduct and so forth, so they can't go out and get a job somewhere else, which happens, okay? Certain standards and training around use of force, for an example. The whole issue around chokeholds, making sure that officers are properly trained in de-escalation techniques, crisis intervention training. The only way they can really make that happen is through attaching it to federal funding. So that states and localities, if they want federal funding for anything, I don't care if it's schools or transportation, they need to be in compliance. There needs to be standards in terms of leadership. We have 18,000 departments in the United States. I can guarantee you we don't have 18,000 good police leaders. And so if we want to really change policing, then it starts with good leadership. And it shouldn't, good leaders in policing are more by accident than design. I mean, there's not the kind of formal structure for people to learn at the first line supervisor, middle manager, police chief, and so forth. So there's a lot that government could do. And I hope they're able to come together and at least do something.
So let's talk where responsibility lies currently, really states and localities. talk a little bit about that. What kind of transparency exists? How do a lot of these departments operate? How are they funded? There's a large call today for defunding police. What does that mean? What kind of resources are allocated to departments? What are they spending that on? How should they be spending it differently? And what role do these local officials play in the process in general?
Well, let's deal with the defund issue first, because when I speak with people to find out exactly what they mean by that, the majority of people are talking about taking some money from the police budget, putting it more into social services, so that people who suffer for a mental health crisis, for an example, maybe homeless outreach, substance abuse counselors, which makes a lot of sense to have that sort of thing at the grassroots level. Now, here's the problem. One, it's going to take a whole lot more money than just pulling a few $1,000,000 out of a police budget. On average, and I can only go with the jurisdictions that I have worked in, DC and Philadelphia, about 95% of the budget is for personnel costs, salaries and benefits. That doesn't leave very much more. I mean, you got to buy cars, you got to buy computers, there's a lot of costs associated with that. So when you pull money, you're impacting personnel at a time, especially now where you got rising crime rates. And so it's a little more complicated than some people make it out to be. But I have not spoken with a single police chief that is opposed to the idea of beefing up social services so that they can be first responders. We should not have to be first responders for everything, but it doesn't mean that we won't have to respond to some of these calls are pretty dangerous, And so a social worker is not going to walk in there, or a person armed with a knife or a gun, right? They're going to still call the cops. But it doesn't mean that we don't have the right training in place to de-escalate, to try to resolve it short of using any level of force at all. And so, they need to redirect the money. I don't have a problem with that, but it's going to take a lot more. The reason police have it to begin with is because cities have cut budgets year after year after year of social services. And they're not available 3 a.m. on a Friday night. And that's what you need.
Well, I think part of the equation too is what people see on camera, right? When you think about budgets, and when you think about Ferguson, and when you think about George Floyd, you see like tactical military style vehicles. You see armed personnel. You see like warriors on streets, right? I mean, is that what policing in America should look like? Is that where resources should be going? Well, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I heard some commentary from you about whether they're warriors or guardians of the community, right? How is the perception, and how does that then tie into broader perception challenges?
I think you have to be a little bit of both, and you have to have both kinds of equipment. I mean, when you look at just this year, I think there have been, many mass shooting incidents. I forget the exact number now, but it was highlighted. But I mean, it's like astounding how many mass shootings have occurred. Who do you think, who responds to those things? When you get, something like Orlando or some of these other locations that have had mass shootings, I mean, it's the police that respond. And you got to show up with more than a flashlight and a 9mm on your side. You're going to have to need proper equipment in order to be able to resolve it. Now, having said that, how you deploy makes a difference. For a First Amendment assembly, for a peaceful protest, you don't need to have the heavy gear out there. You just need to make sure people can protest, and the counter demonstrators have their voices heard, the two don't clash. I mean, you don't have destruction of property. That's your role. You don't have to roll that stuff out for that, but it doesn't mean you don't need to have it. So policy, training, those kinds of requirements, I think, are very essential. But to think that the only thing that you do is, try to get, kids off a corner or something like that, and not have to respond to anything more than that is just not realistic.
So when it comes to the challenge of bad police officers or accountability, right? Derek Chauvin, I think he had like 18 warnings or violations, right? Like, how hard is it as the head of a department, as a chief, to kind of hold your own force accountable? And what are the challenges associated with that? Is it just the structures, the arbitration in place? How does it all work? And how do you hold accountable?
It's difficult to get rid of a bad police officer if they're not criminally charged. And even then, if they're not convicted, you might wind up getting them back. I have fired officers, and I've successfully fired officers, but I've had others that I've fired that, in my opinion, have no right being a police officer, yet they were given their jobs back. I think the arbitration process is problematic, and some light needs to be shed on that. Some of the decisions made by arbitrators are absolutely baffling, and yet they do it behind closed doors. And so, I come from a background where if you make a decision, you have to be able to stand it up, support it. Don't be afraid of it. You made it, you own it, right? They don't have to do that. And so I really do think there are a lot of things within the system that could be changed. I also think unions have gotten too powerful. I'm not anti-union, but they have gotten more powerful over the years. In fact, now they form political action committees, so they actually donate to political campaigns. So they are literally, financially supporting many elected officials, which obviously is going to have an influence on some of the decisions they make in terms of legislation and so forth. And so, there's a combination of things, but again, that's an area that's ripe for reform, but it's going to have to probably be done at the local level.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about recruitment, right? As a chief, how are you recruiting and retaining and diversifying talent? We had Bishop Garrison on a call recently. He's now a new senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, focused on human capital and workforce and diversity. How are police departments around the country focused on those issues? How do you build a pipeline? How do you attract and recruit talent, especially in a climate like this where there is genuine hostility and tension as it relates to law enforcement?
Well, it's very difficult right now. Departments across the country are really struggling to get enough applicants, qualified applicants, within the ranks, and certainly diversity is always a problem. But I think there's an opportunity here, and that is to really, if people who really want to see change really comes from within. You can pass laws and you can do all that kind of stuff from the outside. But if you don't change the culture, if you don't change the mindset, if you don't do those kinds of things, it's hard for those changes to really take hold in reality. And so people within an organization to come into our ranks with a different attitude, I think is essential. So it's an opportunity. You want to make a difference? Then don't just talk about it, do something about it, become a police officer, be part of the change that's taking place. We have to market better and really go after individuals that probably never would have thought about being a police officer. I'm one of them. I didn't grow up wanting to be a police officer. I didn't have anything against policemen. I just never thought about it and kind of accidentally fell into it. But there's a whole population of people that I think would of all races, all genders, that would become police officers if given the opportunity.
So talk a little bit more about that. Like how much of this relates to the framing of the role and the marketing and the positioning of why to do this, right? And I've heard you speak a little bit about educating law enforcement about defending the Constitution, about the presence of justice, not just absence of crime. I mean, how important are things like that when you're trying to get folks to come in and even change the culture in a department?
Well, I mean, it's very important. And I think it also starts with acknowledging the history of policing in America, that when you look at the history of policing in the United States, police have not always stood on the right side of justice as we view justice today. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the civil rights era in the 60s. And, when protesters walked across the Pettus Bridge, on what later became known as Bloody Sunday. I mean, who was waiting for them on the other side? Police. Who enforced Jim Crow laws of the time? Police. And so you can go back as far as you want in American history, and you can find a role that police or police-like groups played that were negative, particularly toward minorities or new immigrants. And so, it's important to know that, because if you don't know the history, then it's hard to kind of come with a starting point, to understand where some people are coming from, so you can empathize with their position and then start to try to build the relationship, build that trust. And I think that has to be part of it. But then for people coming in, not only need to know the history, they need to know what does the future look like? I mean, what does the 21st century police officer, what's the kind of role they'll play? I mean, what are the kinds of things you'll have me doing? It's not just cops and robbers chasing bad guys. It's building those relationships. It's community policing. It's doing all those kinds of things to bring a sense of safety and security to neighborhoods.
How tied in is race into law enforcement and this narrative, right? I mean, you talk about trust. I mean, how challenging and intertwined is the race conversation in policing. And also weave that into like the role of immigrants, right? You have a lot of immigrant communities who are paranoid about law enforcement in their countries and maybe are weary of law enforcement here now, right? How does all that play together?
Well, race is an issue like it is with the rest of our society. I mean, that's who we recruit from. I mean, we're not, recruiting on Mars. I mean, we're recruiting right from the United States of America, and there's race problems within our own country. So we have to deal with that. In fact, there's a new dimension to recruiting now to make sure you don't have people with extremist views, to make sure they're not in our ranks. January 6th kind of opened our eyes to some of that sort of thing in the military and policing and so forth. And so, yeah, it plays a role, but it doesn't mean that it's that you can't overcome it, that it's an obstacle that cannot be overcome, because it can. It is about people. It's about interaction. It's about building trust. People want to feel safe. And quite frankly, when they call 911, they don't care if it's Hispanic, Black, white, Asian, they don't care, just get here, right? And it's about treating people respectfully. And I have seen it. I've seen white officers in all Black neighborhoods are some of the best cops I've ever seen in terms of how they empathize and treat the community. I've seen Black officers interacting with white or Hispanic, the same thing. And I've seen others that were just totally opposite, that were terrible when it came to dealing with people. And so it's about the individual, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't diversify our ranks as much as possible. We need to continue to strive for that. But what we need more than anything are people who in our ranks to treat people respectfully.
When I was in grad school, we learned a lot about Comstat and broken windows policing. And they were kind of models back then as just like how innovation and technology and accountability were used. But today, when you reflect back on some of these practices, what were the drawbacks? What were the negative aspects of some of these kind of trends that emerged? And it seemed to have kind of spread to departments across the country.
Well, it did spread to departments across the country. It originated in New York. I mean, Jack Maple, Bill Bratton, that group back in the early 90s are the ones that really started it. And if you think back to the 90s, we were in the middle of the crack wars. I mean, New York had more than 2,000 homicides in a single year. I was in Chicago. We had like 3 years where we came close to 1,000 murders. I mean, murders were off the hook, and a lot of them were drug related. So people were looking, again, for police to do something. And what they did was they were able to, through use of technology, not only target areas where there was intense crime taking place, but even who are the most prolific shooters and robbers and people like that. So we could focus on that particular group. It started with the, broken windows, George Kelling and James Q. Wilson's piece they wrote back in, I think, 82, 84. Anyway, where if you deal with the smaller crimes sometimes lead to bigger crimes. So it's dealing with disorder, and they were very effective in doing that. I think where policing made a mistake, 2 areas. One, we didn't have a strategy in place for when the window got fixed. It's one thing when the window's broken, right? And people would tolerate certain things, and maybe you are a little more aggressive than you would be otherwise. But what do you do when you get that situation taken care of? You can't use the same tactics and the same strategies, okay? You just can't do that. The other thing is, by being so data-driven, and there's a phrase that was actually developed during that same era, put cops on the dots. And I heard that being used when I was in DC, for an example, and I had to stop a meeting once. And I had to remind the people who were we were in the room going through what we call a crime briefing, that, every one of those dots represents a human being whose life has been forever changed because of crime. These aren't just dots on a map. These are people. These are victims. And you can't lose the humanity of policing and that side of policing. You can't get so cold and detached that you're looking at crime as just dots on a map. And so I think we have to be sensitive to that. And I think we kind of lost our way and got a little too carried away with that, pulled away from community policing, didn't realize how fragile those relationships are in these communities, that you have to nurture them every single day, and I think that was the beginning of where we find ourselves today.
But and I feel like that trend continued in New York, especially with stop and frisk. And when I was in New York, I spent a lot of time talking to law enforcement who were frustrated by those policies because it made it harder for them to actually do community policing, because there was almost quotas put in place that they were supposed to stop a certain number of people to do this, right? So how does that just exacerbate the lack of trust and make it harder for law enforcement even?
Once things start getting manageable, do you still use the same tactics that got you there? And the answer to that should be no, it's not. And so when you have a strategy, it's almost like, when America got involved in Iraq and supposedly, they had a strategy for getting in. And then, one of the people there, I forget who it was now, I think it was Powell, asked, well, what's our strategy for getting out? And there was no strategy for exit. And that's probably the most important piece. It's easy to start something, not so easy to end it. And you've got to have a period of time when you start winding down and transition to maintenance, to community building. How does the community sustain what's been achieved? Because you can't keep 100 extra policemen in an area forever. They got to move on, right? So how does the community, and many of our challenged communities are not that organized. So how do you build that? And it may not be police doing it, the city can do that.
So how do you define success as it relates to law enforcement, right? I mean, you talked about murders. Is it just murders coming down? What are the metrics that people in the community should be looking at in terms of like success as it relates to safety and security and community policing? Like what is a win for in your eyes as you've lived?
We tend, and unfortunately it's something and it's driven by the media to a large extent, and police have certainly backed it up. The only stat at the end of the year that people pay attention to is murder. Right now, everyone is concerned about crime because the murder rate is up. They're not looking at anything other than murders and shootings. Yet reality is safety and security. Most people and most communities are not impacted by that crime. It's the part one crime that occurs with the least amount of frequency but gets the most attention. And I understand that. It is the ultimate crime, no question about it. But when you ask about how do you measure, it's some of it's qualitative as much as it is anything else. When you've got a neighborhood that's been infested with crime, drug trafficking, all this kind of stuff, and that's all you see on a block, and then you come back later after community policing and problem solving, you see kids playing, you see a lot that was filled with garbage and using it to hide drugs and guns. And now it's clean and people are planting a garden, they've turned it into a garden. Kids are able to play in a park and old folks sit on the park bench. That's success. That's success. You're not going to get a number to go along with that, but that's success because that means they have a sense of safety and security now that they didn't have before. And we've got to look at those kinds of things as well, the before and after, not just numbers, because you walk into a community meeting and you come in there with a whole lot of numbers as if that's supposed to make people feel better, and they go to bed at night with the sound of gunshots. I mean, come on, where are you going with that?
So when you take a step back and we think about safer neighborhoods, a lot of that is tied to people being able to have upward mobility, right? And some of the challenges related to that is just the entire criminal justice system, mass incarceration, disproportionate accountability. How do you view like the role of law enforcement as it ties into the other aspects of criminal justice? Let's talk about prosecutors, judges, transparency. How does all this play in? Because policing is really just one aspect of the broader criminal justice reform strategy that's needed in this country.
The report I alluded to earlier in the conversation, President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the very first recommendation was that there be an assessment of the entire criminal justice system, not just police. The entire system. The last time there was a comprehensive look at the entire system, Lyndon Baines Johnson was president of the United States. And many of the people, if not most people that are listening to this podcast, weren't born when LBJ was president of the United States. How much has changed since the 60s? Obviously a lot. And so we need to sit back and we need to take a look at the whole system. And we also need to take a look at the front end. Poverty, education, poor housing. What are the drivers? What brings people into the system to begin with? And then on the back end, we need to look at reentry. We need to look at how people can assimilate back into society and gain full rights again, be able to vote again. You did your time. I mean, it shouldn't be a life sentence, right? I mean, you should be able to, if you stay on the straight and narrow. So you need to look at the entire process. I believe that the way we look at criminal justice, instead of looking at it as police feeding the criminal justice system, which is basically what we're feeders, we should be trying to starve the criminal justice system. And in order to starve the system, it's going to take a lot of upfront work dealing with these larger societal issues that really drive crime to begin with. They won't end all crime. There's always going to be somebody who's going to try to make a fast buck and do it illegally. But we could do a lot more toward keeping as many people as possible with a sense of opportunity. I don't have to do this. I've got a future. And there are many of our kids don't feel like they have one.
So I feel like a lot of the community policing conversation is related to direct police action and interaction with the community. How should law enforcement be interacting with the prosecutors, with judges? What kind of transparency is missing with those two roles in the system?
Well, you know, people are always talking about transparency in police. Police are the most transparent out of everyone in the system. I mean, who else is wearing body cameras? You know, have you ever seen a prosecutor during a plea bargain with a camera on? You know, the George Floyd, the Chauvin murder trial was unusual in that they allowed cameras into the courtroom. That was only because that particular judge said it was okay. I mean, there aren't regular cameras in a courtroom. I mean, why aren't there? Why can't people know more about what's going on? You know, why don't we know more about what's going on inside of prison walls? What's being done to rehabilitate individuals, to get them ready? I mean, you got a 20-year sentence. You go in with a 5th grade reading level. How come you can't leave with a bachelor or a master's degree? Right? I mean, you've got to do something to change an individual. It's not going to happen overnight, you know, but the system is designed to punish individuals for their behavior. That's what it was designed for. And it'll continue to do that until there are fundamental changes and reimagining of what criminal justice system ought to look like.
So as a closing, you know, are you looking to the future? Do you see a silver lining? Are you optimistic about broader reform and changes in this country? Are you pessimistic?
Optimistic, silver lining. In fact, you know, I'm retired now, but there's a big part of me that really wishes I was in the middle of it, because this is an exciting time. I know people look at it in kind of as a downer, depressed, and, you know, oh, this is horrible, this is terrible. But there's opportunity here, because real change usually comes about as a result of a crisis of some kind in society. I mean, you know, if it wasn't for the protests of the 1960s, I never would have had the opportunity to become police chief in Washington, D.C. or commissioner in Philadelphia. That's just a fact. The crisis, it was all brought to a head in the 60s. And there was opportunity then that came after it. Was it enough? No. But you have to build on it. Nothing happens overnight. Nothing happens overnight. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic. This is going to turn around. It doesn't mean there'll be no more bad videos, because there will. There'll always be some cop that does something, you know, they got no business doing, right? Hopefully at one point in time, media shows some good videos and not just the bad ones, because there's more good ones out there than bad ones. So we need to just bring balance back and get away from this extreme right, extreme left mentality that we seem to have in this country right now, and find the balance we need to make for a better society.
Well, I think a lot of people listening, and me personally, I think we'd all benefit to having your voice a little louder in this conversation. So Chief Ramsey, an absolute pleasure. Appreciate you taking the time to join us today on Coffee with Ken. Thank you to everyone tuning in. Our next conversation is right after Memorial Day on June 3rd. We're going to have Katie Fallon, the new Chief Global Impact Officer of McDonald's. Look forward to that. Chief, stay safe. Enjoy your time with your granddaughter. Everyone listening, please continue to wear a mask, practice social distancing, wash your hands, and get a vaccine. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well. Bye, everyone.
You too.